days when you can't play the lottery, right? Shouldn't. Uh, this morning there was something happened with the class of 2024 exam that they had to change the schedule, so that meant that we had to move your lecture to 1, and I said no, not fair. And but there is something trying to, no? We fix that something like, my goodness. Something doesn't want you to do, start at a certain time. Well, I've learned that when you find a door that is closed, you knock. If they don't open, you knock again. But maybe third time, you never force the door open or no. Maybe there is another door. Okay, and that's what we have to find. What is the other door? Okay, in the past, you know that how was everything organized many years ago? Everything was like a pyramid from top to bottom. It was a king, and people with lots of power, then less and less and less power. And there was a time during the 60s, you know, remember the missiles crisis? They put some missiles in Cuba, the Russians and so on. The government realized it's not a good idea to have the power centralized in one place, because if there is a bomb in Washington, D.C., there is no more USA. So they started getting the internet. So they could put the power centers in different places. So if one of these power centers is attacked, the USA continues existing. Okay, and more or less, what they are doing right now with everything, with information, news, okay, there is not a single person, okay, in charge of giving you what is the information that is important. Everybody can be a news creator, an editor, okay, and it's complicated. It's like when you have, for example, a disco club. If there is only one door, and there is a guy at the door that you have to pay money, or they decide who goes in, who doesn't. If they say no, what are you gonna do? But what if there are other 10 doors that you can walk around the disco club and decide, oh, they didn't let me in that door, but let me try the other door, let me try the other door. There is always a possibility. Okay? So that's something you learn after many years of fighting against the same door. So we were talking about these cells, okay, in the lungs. Okay, what is the structure of this alveolo-capillary membrane? We were talking about the pneumocytes type 1. They are resting on this basement membrane that contains collagen. There are different types of collagen, type 1, 2, 3, 4. In this case, we have collagen type 4. It's not necessary that you learn the other types now. Okay, but as a type of advancing what is going to appear in pathophysiology. In the kidneys, we also have type 4 collagen. Okay, so there are conditions in which we develop antibodies against type 4 collagen, and they may destroy specifically the kidneys and the lungs. Okay, because of they share this protein. Okay, and then this basement membrane separates the cells, the type 1 pneumocytes, from the pulmonary capillaries. That is a very, very, very thin membrane, but it's very effective, okay, in preventing the water from going into the alveoli, okay, and also preventing that bubbles of air move from the alveoli into the blood. Because imagine what would happen if the air enters into the blood and starts circulating in the body. Okay, efficient gas exchange prevents bubbles from entering the circulation, prevents the water transudation, prevents edema. Okay, specifically. Okay, and now we can move to the other part. Okay, here we are going to have some concepts. Okay, I'm sure that when you see these slides, like, oh my goodness, now we have the very complex part, physics, about formula, about numbers. But if you analyze this carefully, you're going to realize that it's more or less the same thing that we studied in cardiovascular system. Okay, in cardiovascular system, we studied the cardiac output. We studied the stroke volume, the heart rate. You multiply stroke volume times heart rate. Okay? Thank you so much. And you obtain the cardiac output. Okay, amount of blood that the heart pumps per minute. Okay, here we are going to be talking about the concepts that are very similar, but now it's air instead of blood. Okay? For example, start with the first concept, minute ventilation. First of all, know what is ventilation, air, moving in and out. Okay, it's the volume of air that enters and leaves the lung every minute. Okay, so it's very similar, okay, to concepts that we saw in the heart. It will depend on the respiratory rate and the tidal volume. You remember from yesterday, the graph with the volumes and capacities, the volume of air that enters in and out in the lungs in a normal, quiet respiration, around 500 milliliters in every minute. Simply calculate what is the respiratory rate, what is the tidal volume, and you have the minute ventilation. See how similar this is to the cardiac output, and now respiratory rate instead of heart rate, and tidal volume instead of stroke volume, which is the same thing, the same concept. And you have there, okay, this is an example, a tidal volume of 500 times 15 respiratory rate. We are going to have a minute ventilation of 7.5 liters per minute. Now remember that that's the entire air that enters the lungs, from the trachea to the last alveoli there. There is a portion of that air that will stay in the trachea, bronchi, secondary, tertiary, etc., in all of this conducting zone from which we don't have any kind of gas exchange. So we have to subtract to this amount the area or the air that is left in the dead space or in the anatomical dead space, conducting area. Okay? And that is going to give us, okay, another value. Okay? That is the alveolar ventilation. That is the amount of air that enters in the respiratory zone, which is very easy to calculate. Okay, you take the entire minute ventilation and you subtract 150, which is the amount of air that stays in the conducting zone. Okay, alveolar ventilation is always going to be lower, okay, than the minute ventilation because of that air that stays in the dead space. So using this, we can calculate the dead space ventilation. Okay, that equals 150 times respiratory rate, which is 2 liters and a quarter, okay, of air that stays in the dead space per minute. Okay, and then we have, if you want to calculate the alveolar ventilation, simply minute ventilation minus dead space ventilation gives you 5 liters and a quarter. Okay, there are many ways of calculating this. Okay, that's only one. Now I want you to notice something. Okay, if you remember, the cardiac output at rest in an average person at rest was how much? How many liters, how many milliliters? Cardiac output at rest?
45 liters.
45 liters?
45.
Oh. That's okay. 5 liters are around 5 liters. Okay, if you take the average stroke volume 70, and you take the average heart rate 70 per minute, 70 times 70, or less 5 liters. Notice that there is almost a matching. Okay, so we send 5 liters of blood per minute to that area, and also 5 liters of air per minute. So they almost match. Okay, and there is a topic in pulmonary physiology that is the matching between ventilation and perfusion that would take around 2 years to get. Okay? The lungs are very, very special organs, and they are divided in different zones depending on the position of the body. Okay? If we are standing, okay, there are going to be certain relationship between the ventilation and the perfusion in the top of the lungs, in the middle, and in the bases. Okay? And how the body matches the ventilation and the perfusion in different areas of the lungs is another science. Okay? And that science is something that we are going to be little by little introducing. Okay? The most important thing to get today is normally, physiologically, there is a small mismatch between the ventilation, the amount of air that enters the alveoli, and the perfusion, the amount of blood that goes to the pulmonary capillaries. So there is normally a mismatch. Okay? Ideally, the ventilation and the perfusion should be matched. That means for every liter of blood, there should be 1 liter of air. Okay? Ideally. But physiologically, we have a small mismatch, which doesn't have any kind of problem for our health. In fact, we live 80 years, 90, 100 years without knowing if there is a match or a mismatch. No, that doesn't represent any problem. Now, when we exercise, those things match. Okay? That means that it's like if everything is designed to be used while exercising. Or maybe we simply don't exercise what we are supposed to exercise. No? And we consider physiological. Okay, we say physiologically, we refer to the person at rest. We are not supposed maybe to be at rest. No? And we are studying the wrong thing. But when we are exercising, those things match perfectly. Remember, we were talking about the upper part of the lungs that we typically don't use. Okay, that is added to the dead space. And when we exercise, we recruit those blood vessels and we start using them. We have an increase in the cardiac output. We also increase the respiratory rate. And all these things match one to one. So when you study the physiology of exercise, that's why I told you this is another science. Okay? You study how that happens. Okay? Now, in pathophysiology, we are going to study diseases. Okay? So we are not going to study how they get to match, because that is physiology of exercise. We are going to study what happens when the slight mismatch that we have physiologically gets worse. Okay? When we have areas that are supposed to be ventilated and they are not. For example, someone may have an aspiration of a foreign body. Okay, so we are going to have an area of the lung that doesn't receive air, hypoventilated. Okay, there is perfusion, there is blood, but there is no air. So there is a mismatch between the ventilation and the perfusion. Or another person may have an embolus blocking the pulmonary circulation, pulmonary embolism. So there is an area of the lung with normal ventilation, but no perfusion. So in any case, okay, there is a mismatch between the ventilation and the perfusion. And that leads to different syndromes, different signs, symptoms that we see in patients. Okay, the most common is cyanosis. Okay, that will appear as a result of the lack of oxygenation of the blood. Now, we were talking about oxygen. Okay, remember when we were talking about the hemoglobin, about this cooperative effect of the hemoglobin molecules, okay, how the hemoglobin picks the oxygen, okay, from the capillaries, from the alveoli, when it circulates in the capillaries of the pulmonary circulation. Okay, normally oxygen, most of it is transported bound to hemoglobin. There you see the amount of the oxygen that travels bound to hemoglobin, 20.1 milliliters of oxygen, okay, per 100 milliliters of blood. That is when the hemoglobin is 100% saturated. Okay, considering that it is 100% saturated. Now there is a small, very small portion, okay, that travels dissolved in the blood. Okay, that is 0.3, tiny. Okay, milliliters of oxygen per every 100 milliliters of blood. When you add them, you are going to have the total amount of oxygen in the blood. Okay, so for every 100 milliliters of blood, we are going to have 20.4 milliliters of oxygen. Okay, if you start adding up all the oxygen of all the blood that we have in the circulation, arterial, venous circulation, and you add the oxygen that we have in the lungs after we breathe in, okay, you are going to have around 1,550 milliliters of oxygen. Okay, that is something that someone calculated, and I memorized like 30 minutes ago. Okay. Now, if you consider that the oxygen consumption of the average person, 70 kilograms male, that is the typical, this is what we call the Guyton man. Have you heard that? Have you heard about the Guyton's man? Guyton was a very famous physiologist, and this is the one who wrote the first books of physiology, medical physiology, and everything he describes in that book is for the 70 kilograms male. And that's what we call the Guyton's man. But this average 70 kilograms male consumes 250 milliliters of oxygen per minute, just by existing. Okay, imagine someone who is lying down, not moving a single muscle, and with the eyes closed. That existing position, okay, consumes or needs 250 milliliters of oxygen. So, for how long can that Guyton's man resist apnea? You tell this Guyton's man, stop breathing. How many minutes will they be alive? 1,550 divided by 250 gives you around 6 minutes. 6.2 minutes. Later, they are going to be out of oxygen, rid of oxygen. And if there is no oxygen, neurons in the hippocampus die first, then the rest of the neurons, then other stuff. Okay? So 6 minutes of apnea is the maximum amount. If we open the eyes, it's going to be a lot less. Okay? Because we're going to consume more. Now, there are people who consume more oxygen than other people. For example, children have a higher rate of consumption, have a faster metabolic rate. Okay? People with hyperthyroidism, people who are taking medications that accelerate the metabolism, okay, that have a faster consumption. Please don't do any experiments with this. Don't try to make sure that this is true. This is a dogma that you have to be. Don't experiment with this, okay? So there you have the oxygen moving from the alveoli, okay, to bind to hemoglobin. Okay, this is the loading hemoglobin. We were talking the left-shifted hemoglobin. By the way, I found a mnemonic about to learn about this right shift, left shift. Okay, it was for the right shift. It was cadets. CADETS. CO2. Okay, the E was for what? Cadets. CO2. The T was for temperature. The D was for DPG, this molecule. A. What was the A? Temperature. Acidosis. For CO2, acidosis. DPG, this 2.3 DPG, diphosphoglycerate. The E was for what? What is E? Huh?
Can you repeat it louder?
Louder.
Yeah.
How loud?
The fan kind of makes
How many decibels you want me to repeat? Yeah, I know. let me write it down. CO2. Got it. I don't know if you're gonna see from there. CO2 acidosis.
E is exercise.
Oh, thank you. DPG. This is the 2.3.
Yeah.
Okay, E is exercise. We have the temperature. And S. Who found out? What was the S? Who Googled that?
But it
Hem-
only shows me.
Hemoglobin. Who has hemoglobin S? Do you know about hemoglobin S? Hmm? Have you heard? Okay. Sickle cell anemia. Okay, all these things, when they are present, when they increase, you have high CO2, high acidosis, which is the same as high hydrogen ions. You have high concentration of 2, 3 BPG. You are engaging in exercise. You have high temperature, and people with sickle cell disease or hemoglobin S. All these things lower the affinity of hemoglobin for oxygen, so make the hemoglobin to become unloading. For a right shifter, you can use, instead of unloading, releasing, and that you have the R. L, left shift for loading, R for releasing or unloading. And just remember the situation in the muscle. For me, it's easier to remember how is the muscle during exercise. Hot, it's warm, it's producing CO2, lactic acid. Okay. So here we have the loading of hemoglobin, of oxygen. Okay, it's traveling. Okay, very little oxygen in solution. Most of it combined with hemoglobin, and then the unloading of oxygen here. Okay, form the deoxyhemoglobin. Remember this unloading situation. Okay, for that unloading to occur, remember what happens, the hydrogen ions enter inside the red blood cell. They are gonna produce the detachment of this 2.3 DPG that will go out. Okay, this release of 2.3 DPG will make the hemoglobin, okay, to it's the other way around. Okay, there is a release of 2.3 dpg there, and there is the unloading of oxygen in the tissues. Now, what about carbon dioxide? We have been talking about this reaction of the carbonic anhydrase previously. Okay, carbon dioxide most of it is transported, okay, bound to, or as bicarbonate. A small amount is transported bound to hemoglobin, okay, forming this carbaminohemoglobin. Okay. Notice that carbon dioxide binds to the globin part, not to the heme. It doesn't compete with oxygen. Okay, there is a small fraction dissolved in water, less than 5%. Okay, the majority travels converted into carbonic acid as bicarbonate. And there you have a list of steps. Okay, that is very similar to things that we have been mentioning before. Carbon dioxide comes from the metabolism of the cells. Okay, when they produce ATP, it enters the erythrocyte, forms carbonic acid. We have this enzyme, carbonic anhydrase, same that we have in the saliva. Okay, then this carbonic acid dissociates to form hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. Okay, the bicarbonate is pumped out of the cells. Notice that in this step you are going to learn something important. When the bicarbonate, which is an anion, goes out of the cell, has to be in exchange for chloride, which is another anion. Okay, the cells want to maintain the electroneutrality. Okay, so when they lose an anion, they want to gain another. So we don't have excessive negative or positive charges inside the red blood cells. Okay, bicarbonate pumps out, chloride enters. You don't want to have a resting membrane potential in the erythrocyte, and so it becomes excitable by any means. That's not the purpose of the red blood cells. Now the bicarbonate in the plasma, okay, the one that went out combines with sodium, that travels to the lung, okay, and the hydrogen ion will cause the release of oxygen from the hemoglobin. Okay, the hemoglobin absorbs these excess hydrogen ions, acting as a buffer. That is one of the functions of hemoglobin, helping to maintain the pH. Okay, then when the cell reaches the lung, all the process is reversed. Okay, the bicarbonate is taken back into the cell in exchange for chloride, and the entire process will be reversed, as you have here. Okay, you have the different ways by which bicarbonate travels. Okay, this is happening in the tissues, exercising tissue. This is happening in the lungs, in the pulmonary circulation. Okay, notice the different ways that CO2 travels, dissolved, okay, bound to hemoglobin. And here below you have the reaction of the carbonic anhydrase. Okay, you have the generation of carbonic acid, the dissociation, the exchange for chloride, okay, the release of hydrogen that will help in the release of oxygen that will enter the tissues. And on the right side you have the reversal. Okay, you have the red blood cell taking back the bicarbonate, okay, in exchange for chloride. Okay, this bicarbonate binding to the hydrogen, forming the carbonic acid that will dissociate by the action of the carbonic anhydrase into CO2 and water, and CO2 goes to the alveolus. Okay, when this happens, we're going to have the hemoglobin picking up oxygen and releasing that hydrogen to form this process here. Now, let's go back a little bit here, okay, because sometimes when we study these things, okay, and we say, okay, the total amount of blood, of oxygen in the blood is 20.4 milliliters per every 100 milliliters. Okay, and we see that the hemoglobin has so much oxygen, that is amazing, compared to the oxygen in the plasma. And we may underestimate the role of that little amount of oxygen. And we tend to favor and admire hemoglobin for that, for having that much oxygen. But remember that when you go to the tissue level, let's say this is a cell that needs oxygen, okay, and this is a red blood cell, has hemoglobin, 20.1, so on. And here we have very little, but the oxygen that the cells are using is actually this one here. Okay? Cells don't get the oxygen directly from the hemoglobin. Okay, the cells get the oxygen that is dissolved in the plasma. That is the one that will, by diffusion, enter through the endothelial membrane. Oxygen will diffuse here, okay, and will go to the tissues. Now, when this oxygen here drops, then hemoglobin is going to release oxygen, and then it's going to diffuse here. Okay, so diffusion will occur from the hemoglobin to the cytosol of the red blood cell, from the cytosol of the red blood cell to the interstitium, to the plasma, from the plasma through the endothelial cell membrane, through the other endothelial cell membrane, etc., etc. Okay, there are many, many, many processes of diffusion. Okay, from one place to another, and it's important to know that because when we analyze the total oxygen of the blood, let's say you have a person that has 20.4 milliliters per 100 milliliters of blood, that's great. and we may see another that has only 20.1. We may say, oh, that's not a great difference. Well, maybe it happens that all the oxygen they have is bound to hemoglobin and is not being released. Those tissues are not getting oxygen. Okay, we may have a person with 100% saturation of hemoglobin and be dying because the oxygen is not being released. Okay, the hemoglobin is so strongly bound to this oxygen that it's not letting go. Okay, and sometimes the numbers tell us something, and what is actually going on in the tissues is another thing. Okay, that tiny proportion, okay, is extremely important for the tissues to get the oxygen. Okay, remember we don't treat numbers, we have to put together many different things. Okay, sometimes because of we don't have too much time, we are taking care of many patients at the same time. We have a patient that is in distress, we put the pulse oximeter, 98, you're okay, let me move on. That is a number. It's telling you a percentage, okay, of oxygen in hemoglobin. It's not telling you how much oxygen is reaching the tissues. Okay? It's important to know what you are looking at. It's like averages. When we look at research, okay, let's say I am eating in a table with in a restaurant with Elon Musk. I am having dinner with Elon Musk, and someone makes a research and calculates the average income of the table. That doesn't benefit me. No, that's not fair. Average income. If I don't have a car and my neighbor has 2 cars, we both have 1 car. Make sure that we know what we are reading and what is the meaning of those numbers. So here we have more details about this carbonic anhydrase reaction, okay, and how it participates, for example, in the regulation of the blood pH. Okay, one of the functions of the proteins in the body, hemoglobin, other proteins, is to act as buffers. They get excess hydrogen from the blood, and they release hydrogen when it's necessary, when it's not very abundant. Okay, they are pH buffers. There you have the role of the lungs in the regulation of the blood pH. Is the most important organ in regulating pH. Okay, it's the one that acts minute after minute, releasing CO2. Okay, if you have to wait for the kidneys to participate in regulating blood pH, you have to wait like 24 hours, 48. They are not very in the mood of regulating pH. It's the lung, the one who actually does most of the work. Okay, if, for example, there you have this reaction, and notice that there are double arrows. So this is a reversible reaction. And you remember from chemistry studies, that means that when you have too much of the reactants or too much of the product, okay, the reaction is going to move in one direction or in another. So let's say someone is not breathing. Someone has an opiate overdose. Okay, opiate overdose suppresses, inhibits the respiratory center. That means the diaphragm is going to contract maybe 0.5 centimeters every 30 seconds or so. So that is what we call hypoventilation. That means the lungs don't get air and don't release the CO2. Carbon dioxide accumulates, and then it's going to bind to water, forming carbonic acid, okay, producing hydrogen and bicarbonate, okay. And if you add to this, because if you analyze only that equation, you say, well, they're going to balance each other, so the pH is not going to change. But remember, we have to add to this the lack of oxygen. That cells are not receiving oxygen. If they don't get oxygen, they have to shift from aerobic respiration, that normally produces CO2 and water, to anaerobic respiration, that will produce lactic acid. Okay, so we are going to have the accumulation of the CO2, the not elimination of the CO2, and the production of excess hydrogen, and also the production of lactic acid, which adds more hydrogen. So people are going to develop an and acidosis. That we call respiratory because the first one who fails is the lung. Can the kidneys compensate? Yes, but you have to wait 24 hours. That's not an emergency for the kidneys. The kidneys, okay, the pH is going down. I will activate a mechanism to eliminate the excess hydrogen and start producing new bicarbonate. But that takes a while. Okay, that takes a while. That's why we can't stop breathing. Okay, because the kidneys don't cooperate in that sense. You have any question?
No.
Ah, okay. So below you have here the different mechanisms that we have. For example, when hemoglobin or any plasma protein or any protein is in an alkaline medium, okay, they release hydrogen ions. When they are in an acidic medium, they typically pick up. They take this hydrogen from the medium. Okay, they act as buffers to regulate the pH of the tissues. Well, there we have the same thing that we were looking at the other day, the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. Okay, remember what that means. Okay, remember the importance of the sigmoid curve. Okay, this shape, sigmoid shape is given by this cooperativity that we were mentioning in the hemoglobin molecules. There are different types of hemoglobin. Okay, typically the adults, we have a hemoglobin that is called hemoglobin A. Okay, that has 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. But during the fetal life, we have fetal hemoglobin. Okay, fetal hemoglobin doesn't have the beta chains. Okay, it has alpha chains and gamma chains, if I'm not mistaken. And it's a hemoglobin that has a lot more affinity for oxygen than the adult hemoglobin, which is extremely important for the fetus. Okay, this is the normal adult hemoglobin curve. Okay, the fetal hemoglobin is left shifted. It's more loading. Okay, has more affinity for hemoglobin, so the curve is going to be like here. Okay, that means for the same pressure or concentration of oxygen, okay, it will have a greater saturation. If you place another curve here, for the same oxygen pressure, the saturation is going to be greater. That means more affinity. Remember, in the placenta, it's going to be the circulation of the maternal blood, the venous blood of the mother, and the blood of the fetus. They don't mix. They simply come very close to each other. The venous blood of the mother has a partial pressure of oxygen of 40. Okay, at that concentration of oxygen, the maternal blood will have an oxygen saturation of 75. But the fetal blood will have a saturation of 90. So who wins when they start pulling the oxygen back and forth? The one with greatest affinity. Okay, the one that is more relaxed, has a more relaxed hemoglobin. Okay, so the fetal blood in the placenta gets all the oxygen for the fetus. Okay, and that's the way the fetus can live 9 months there of venous blood. Okay, mind that someone takes the superior vena cava and connects it to our brain, to the carotids. We're going to be sending venous blood to our brain. We would be sleeping the entire day. We couldn't even know who we are. Okay. Now there you have the right and the left shift. Okay, there are some laws or effects or things that are studied in physiology. For example, the Bohr effect or the Bohr shift. Okay, that is what explains the increased release of oxygen by the hemoglobin. Okay, in working, this respiring maybe it's not very clarifying. In working tissues, okay, tissues that are using oxygen and releasing CO2. Okay, shift in the hemoglobin curve, okay, can be affected by different things. One things that we mentioned the other day, okay, when the hemoglobin or the red blood cells circulating in the lungs is going to become more left shifted, more loading. When it's in the working tissue, it becomes more releasing, okay, more thins. So there are alterations of the hemoglobin dissociation curve depending on where the red blood cell is circulating. Okay, there are different factors like the metabolism of the cells, the temperature, okay, the presence of the different pH in the blood that will alter, okay, the saturation of the hemoglobin or the change of the hemoglobin from a tense to a more relaxed state. Borg shift, or Borg effect is another name for that. Now there you have the representation of the fetal hemoglobin. Okay, notice what we were explaining before. Okay, compare the saturation of oxygen of the adult hemoglobin. You can use the 40, which is the venous blood, normal at rest pH. Okay, to understand the difference in saturation between adult and fetal hemoglobin. So you understand what is the high affinity, the meaning of this higher affinity. Okay, and you can even try to see, for example, if the mother is exercising, say the mother is exercising strenuously and the venous blood pH goes to 20. Look at the fetal hemoglobin. It's going to be more than 50% saturated, 60 something. But still, will receive enough oxygen to survive. Okay, then after we are born, the fetal hemoglobin starts being replaced by adult hemoglobin. Around 6 months, we change all the hemoglobin. And we can induce the formation of fetal hemoglobin. There is a medication called hydroxyurea. Hydroxyurea, yeah, it's like urine, it's like pee, but it has a hydroxyl that induces the formation of fetal hemoglobin, something that can be used in the treatment of, for example, people with sickle cell anemia. Okay, that we induce the bone marrow, okay, to make fetal hemoglobin. We are going to compensate for the anemia, for the cells that have the abnormal hemoglobin X. Now, myoglobin is a totally different molecule. Okay, it has the same function, but it's in the muscle. But notice that the affinity for oxygen, or the curve of the affinity for oxygen, or the dissociation curve, is not sigmoidal. Okay, notice that it's not like an S-shaped curve. Okay, we have it in the skeletal muscle, we have it in cardiac muscle, and this is a molecule that has a huge affinity for oxygen, more than fetal hemoglobin, more than any other that we have mentioned before. This is a different molecule because it's made of a single polypeptide. We don't have the force of units like hemoglobin, so there is no cooperative effect there. There is no like, oh, if you want, I also, like in hemoglobin, there is no cooperative binding. So instead of having a sigmoidal shape, okay, we have a logarithmic shape. A lot, very, very high affinity. Okay, and compare one with the other. Okay, if you go back, for example, and you look at the saturation of oxygen in the fetal hemoglobin when the oxygen partial pressure is 20, we said before it's around 65 or so. Go to the myoglobin. 20, it's around 90. Okay, so you understand what is the meaning of that, and try to imagine a heart, okay, cardiac fibers that are not receiving oxygen. Someone with ischemia in the heart. Okay, the blood there starts losing the oxygen. When it starts, the ischemia starts, cardiac cells are using oxygen, so the pressure of oxygen starts dropping. When the pressure of oxygen is 20, extremely low, myoglobin still has 90% saturation. So we still can make the heart work because the cardiac cells will get the oxygen from myoglobin. It's like a storage of oxygen for these moments of ischemia. Okay? Now, once the pressure of oxygen reaches 0, because notice that after, let's say we move from 20 to 15, now all the oxygen from myoglobin is going to very quickly drop to 0 after the pressure of oxygen goes below 15 millimeters of oxygen. Okay, that's, so while we have some up to 20 maybe millimeters of pressure of millimeters of mercury, okay, we maintain a very high myoglobin concentration. After that, so we can live for a while after developing heart ischemia, but not for too long. And when you study these things, you try to put all this together with the purpose of the treatment. Okay? When someone has a myocardial infarction, someone has even if they don't have an infarction, if someone has chest pain, we become very scared. Oh my goodness, what is this? And the heart starts beating very fast. So one of the purposes of the therapy is, okay, we are going to give beta blockers to slow down the heart. So the consumption of oxygen is not so fast. We're going to give morphine so they don't have pain, that they are not scared. We're going to give oxygen to increase the saturation of oxygen a little bit. Okay, that's the purpose. We are going to fight against the dropping of the partial pressure of oxygen that is reaching the myocardium and make sure that they can get into the OR for catheterization or for any procedure, okay, stenting or any bypass or anything to maintain them alive.
Professor,
Mm-hmm.
I have a question, please.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm thinking straight. So, a pregnant woman, she's using her adult hemoglobin, right? And then she starts
Are
her the hemoglobin, a pregnant woman.
you using?
Huh?
You say, are you using the hemoglobin?
No, she's working with the adult hemoglobin, right? If she starts exercising, she's using the myoglobin, but
Okay, myoglobin is inside the muscle.
uh-huh.
Hemoglobin in the red blood cell.
Okay.
When what I was referring to is in the placenta. You have the maternal blood, the maternal hemoglobin, adult hemoglobin, and the fetal blood with the fetal hemoglobin. Normally that blood at rest has a concentration of 40 millimeters of oxygen. If the mother exercises, the muscles are going to produce more CO2, are going to consume oxygen, the muscles, and the blood that reaches the placenta may now have a pressure of oxygen maybe of 30 instead of 40. Okay, but still, the fetal hemoglobin will get a lot of oxygen from there. Okay?
So that's what kind of helps it. It's the difference between the myoglobin.
Yeah, but the
and
myoglobin doesn't participate in this.
That's
The
what I was
myoglobin
saying.
is just in case the muscle doesn't get oxygen.
Okay.
It's like, this is the muscle cell, this is myoglobin, I have oxygen here, but I'm using the one that comes from the blood. Oxygen, CO2, oxygen, CO2, contraction, oxygen, contraction, CO2. Oh my goodness, there is no oxygen coming, I will have to take it. Okay, when you start using that?
Very, very good.
This is the venous blood. This is myoglobin. At this point, we are not using the oxygen from myoglobin. Okay? We are not using, it's still 100% saturated. Okay? I am eating every night in a luxury restaurant every night and inviting 5 friends of mine, and my bank account still perfect. Where is this guy getting the money from? That's a mystery. Okay? The owner of the restaurant is my father. I don't pay. No. Now, once you have to try to analyze this. Okay, where we are? Okay, we are in a muscle that is at rest, or let's say we are in a muscle that is receiving arterial blood without any change. So someone who's sleeping is not here. Now, when we start exercising, the partial pressure of oxygen drops because I'm using the oxygen. and releasing CO2. Okay? So now, once we move the blood, oxygen concentration drops from 40 to 30. Let's see what happens. Oh, I'm using some oxygen from myoglobin. I invited, instead of 5, invited 6 friends. And my dad told me, well, you have to pay for one of them at least. No? And after that, when the oxygen drops from 30 to 20, going now to 85. What about when the oxygen pressure drops to 10? I have to take a lot from myoglobin because I'm not getting from the blood circulation. Okay? That means if you have a coronary artery obstruction of 80%, you still get some blood that contains some oxygen, but that may be here. Maybe it's 50% of the oxygen that you normally need. Okay, you still have a lot. Okay? Oh, it's just pain, but let me stop. Oh, I'm better now. When the obstruction goes to 95%, now the blood that reaches the cardiac cells is so little that maybe here, maybe in 10, you still can be alive with that 5%. But don't go to the hospital running. Call 911 and they take you there. Because if you start running to the hospital, then the blood that reaches the myocardium is going to have 0 oxygen. Or we are going to use the heart is working so fast that it uses all the oxygen from myoglobin, and there is no more. Okay.
Can you also explain the mechanism of action?
Also, what do you mean also?
Please. May you? I don't know. Yes.
The
I
mechanism
don't know.
of
I
what?
gave all my energy to the exam, so I'm a little slow today. The second to last bullet, you said that the delayed oxygen release helps slow down the onset of anaerobic respiration.
Yeah. While you have oxygen in myoglobin, you don't have to shift to anaerobic. Okay. While the mitochondria has oxygen to make ATP, everything works fine. Once there is no more oxygen, survival. Okay, glycolysis, make ATP, but produce lactic acid. Pyruvic, lactic, and the pH drops. And
I guess I'm confused about the delayed
delay.
oxygen release.
Yeah.
How
from
exactly
here
is delayed?
from here to here. Okay. Compared to the normal adult hemoglobin. Let's take the 40. Okay. What is the saturation of oxygen at 40? 8.
So,
Okay.
75,
75. Yeah. Or let's take it like this. When adult hemoglobin starts releasing oxygen, when the oxygen pressure goes to 8, when the myoglobin starts releasing the oxygen, when the oxygen pressure is below 40, it's a delay. Waits to start giving up, to start letting go.
Thank you.
That's the delay. Now, how we control that? We have in the brainstem, okay, a group of neurons that we call the respiratory center. Okay, but there is not a single area that is in charge of the respiration. There are several groups of neurons that talk to each other. Okay, we have a group of neurons that is called the central pattern generator. That's a name. That is like the neurons that decide automatically what is going to be our rate and depth of the respiration. So we don't have to take care of that. Okay, we maintain a constant respiratory rate and depth when we are sleeping or resting. Okay, we don't have to spend too much energy in that. But these respiratory centers, okay, are gonna be influenced by many different things. Notice that it's influenced from what we call the higher centers. That means the brain cortex. We can decide, I'm gonna breathe faster now. I'm gonna breathe more slowly. I'm gonna breathe deeper. Okay, we decide that. Okay, or sometimes there are some centers in the limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus, different centers that may activate, okay, or increase the respiration when we have anxiety, we are afraid, we are different emotional situations. Okay, also these respiratory centers receive information from chemoreceptors in the arteries and in the brain itself, okay, that measuring the composition of the cerebrospinal fluid or arterial blood. Okay, these centers receive information from the muscles, okay, diaphragm, intercostals, or the muscles of the respiration, and also from the lungs, the airways, cardiovascular system, muscle, joints, skin, different parts of the body to determine what is going to be our respiratory rate and depth. There you have the different nuclei. Okay, notice okay, on top you have the brainstem, the pons, and below you have the medulla. Okay, and notice that we have two centers in the pons in red. Okay, one is called the pneumotaxic, and the other is called the apneustic. What is the meaning of apnea? No breathing. Okay, so we have a center for in case we are not breathing. It's called apneustic. Okay, and we have another that is pneumotaxic. Maybe the name doesn't tell you anything, but we're gonna see how to use it. Then we have the medulla oblongata. Okay, we have here a little center that is called the Pribotzinger. We're gonna see what it does. And then we have two groups. One is anterior. Notice that the Pribotzinger is like a head, and then you have like a body, no? That is in the anterior part. And then you have something like a backpack, no? It's a little man with a backpack. Okay, the body of the little guy is the ventral respiratory group or anterior, and the backpack is the dorsal, it's in the back, dorsal respiratory group. Okay. You could continue studying this because each of these things is divided in tiny things, and we don't need to get there. Now, how this works? Notice what is this head? It's the decision making. It's like our head. I decide, okay, I want to breathe 30 times a minute. I decide that. The same thing does the little head. That is called Pribotzinger. I don't know why. But it's simply the pacemaker of the respiratory cycle. Okay, the decision maker. We are sleeping, that Pribotzinger or little head there decides our breathing. Now, let's take a look at the two medullary groups. We have the dorsal and you have the ventral. Okay. Notice that the dorsal respiratory group is the one that is normally active during inspiration. Okay, what is it? During inspiration, so we decide we are going to breathe 15 times per minute. Pribotzinger will send a signal to the backpack, okay, and will activate this dorsal respiratory group to send a signal to the diaphragm, and that's inspiration. Do we need to do anything for normal, quiet expiration? Do we need to activate anything? No. Pribotzinger, dorsal respiratory group, diaphragm, there is a recoil of the chest. That's inspiration and expiration. Normal, quiet, tidal volume. Now, what about if we need to have a deep breath? We need to use more muscles. We need to use the external intercostals. We need to sometimes use the pectorals. We need to use the sternocleidomastoids, scalenes. We need to activate more stuff. Okay, so now, notice the function of the ventral, the large respiratory group. Okay? It's inactive during quiet respiration, but it's going to be active during, okay, more, and we need to use more accessory muscles, okay, inspiratory reservalium, expiratory reservalium. We need to activate the accessory muscles of inspiration and expiration. That's going to be its role. Okay, if you want, you can remember if that serves. Okay, the dorsal respiratory group, smaller, will activate one muscle, the diaphragm. The ventral, which is the larger one, is going to activate more muscles. The sternocleidomastoid, scalenes, abdominal, all the muscles that participate in a more forceful inspiration and expiration. What about the ones in the pons? They are the ones that fine-tune everything. Okay? For example, if for some reason we stop breathing during the night, when there is a lot of CO2 accumulating, that means apnea. Okay, that apneustic center is going to be activated. What's going on down there? Okay, there's too much CO2 here. When there is too much CO2, the apneustic center is going to be activated. Apneustic center, and this is going to wake up these guys. They're not working. Okay, the contrary happens with the pneumotaxi. Okay, we are having a drop in CO2. That means we are breathing too fast. That's not good to have very, very little CO2. Not good at all. You're going to understand why. In that case, the upper pontine, the ones here, okay, is going to inhibit respiration. Okay, or for example, when we are, remember the Herring-Brewer reflex, that we try to inflate the lungs too much? Okay, that stretching, excessive stretching of the pleura, excessive stretching of the tissue of the lung is going to activate the pneumotaxic center that will stop inspiration, inhibits, okay, the respiratory movements. And here you have the same thing organized in a different way. Okay, you have the different centers, the different input from the sensory input, chemoreceptors, stretch receptors in the lungs. Okay, this receiving from the joints, etc., the muscles, also from the cortex, from the pons, irritant receptors in case we are inhaling any pollutants. All these things are going to inform the central pattern generator that, depending on the situation, is going to have a faster or slower respiratory rate. Okay? And that central pattern generator is going to activate dorsal ventral respiratory group depending on how many muscles need to be activated and how fast, how frequently. Okay? And that will influence or change or adapt the breathing rhythm, depth, etc. Okay, another representation of the same. Okay, you have here hypothalamus, limbic system, cortex, receptors, okay, entering into the brain stem, okay, influencing all the things that we mentioned before, the interaction between these dorsal ventral respiratory group, etc. We send signals through the somatic motor neurons, okay, to the muscles of respiration, diaphragm, intercostals, etc., to participate in inspiration, active expiration, etc. That's for you to see how these connections are different ways of representing the same. And that's going to be all for today. Okay.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend. Very, very good weekend.
Some of them I don't.
Diaphragm and the breath. Forced inspiration and forced expiration.